Plato's Closet in West Ashley and North Charleston are springing up cash. Just sell us your gently used warm weather styles, like tees, shorts, sandals, and more. We're paying cash on the spot for gently used spring styles for guys and girls. Support sustainable fashion. This spring, do your thing and recycle the spring-inspired clothes, shoes, and accessories that are just hanging in your closet for cash on the spot. Let your spring clothes bloom into cash at Plato's Closet. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
It is time for the April Patreon birthday shoutouts. April is my birth month, so these are my fellow Aries and Tauruses. Those are literally like the only two signs I know because of my birthday. Anyway, we are going to say a very happy birthday to Zoe, Vicky, Helen, Despina, Denise, Annabelle, and Ruth, who are both having a big birthday this year, Jessica, Laura, Jana, Sarah, Maria, Quinn, Lark, Debbie, Kate, and my birthday twin on the 18th, Leanna. I know I am looking forward to a year filled with endless possibilities, and I hope that is true for everyone celebrating this month with me. So to my April birthday patrons, happy birthday. In 1995, 15-year-old Nicole Hurk disappeared on her way to work. Her family fought for years to get justice for her, sometimes going to extremes. In the end, they got justice and changed how the Dutch court system recognized families. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. I want to start very briefly by giving a huge thank you to everyone who has supported the new Patreon and Apple subscription show, Beyond the Files, where I take 22-minute-long Forensic Files episodes, research the cases the way I usually do, and then come up with a Crimelines-like presentation. The first episode is out now, and that 22-minute episode turned into a 50-minute podcast. I have heard from two people who want to listen to the show and get Crimelines ad-free, but they don't use Apple products and they don't like the Patreon platform, which I fully understand. I have been in talks with another company called Supercast to put the show on there as well. Supercast very easily lets you get the show in any podcast app you use, and I should probably have that up and running by the end of May, the beginning of June, and I'll keep you updated. But of course, Crimelines isn't going anywhere, and there will always be plenty of content here, completely free for everybody who wants it. I want to thank Kelly for recommending this case. I do have a feeling that someone else also recommended it to me, but I only have one name on the spreadsheet. So if you also recommended this case, just let me know and I'll give you a shout out on the next episode. I have never covered a case from the Netherlands before, so as always, thank you to Google Translate for your tireless efforts. I was even able to get an entire court filing translated pretty accurately. Most of the media sources are from Eindhoven Dagblad, and it will be linked in the show notes because I am not trying to say that again. Let's go ahead and get started with Nicole Hurk, who was born Nicole Tetmeyer in Germany on July 4th, 1980. Her mother, Angelica, was single, and no father was put on her birth certificate initially. The man that Angelica said was Nicole's father was married at the time, and though she insisted he was the father, he did ask for a blood test. This was pre-DNA paternity testing, so I imagine it was blood typing. He was determined to be the father when Nicole was about a year old, and then he was added to her birth certificate. Now, it doesn't seem like he was involved in her life very much, aside from paying child support. Soon, Angelica had a new man in her life, Ad van den Hurk, who was from the Netherlands. He already had a daughter and 3 sons from his previous marriages, but he did not shy away from taking on the role as Nicole's father. When she was 2, this little family, Angelica, Ad, and Nicole, all moved to the Netherlands together. After Angelica and Ad married, he filed to be legally recognized as Nicole's father in the Netherlands. And this has the same legal standing as we would have in the U.S. with a step-parent adoption, but the process seems like it was a lot easier. Because Angelica had sole custody rights, the Netherlands did not recognize her biological father's paternity as a legal matter. But the kicker was this process wasn't legally recognized in Germany. So Nicole was in an interesting spot of having two legal fathers, depending on what country she was in. We know her birth father didn't lose all rights to her because he was still ordered to pay child support, but from Nicole's perspective, Odd was her father. He was the one who was raising her. In fact, when he and Angelica separated and then later divorced in 1989, Odd was given custody of Nicole. He then remarried a woman named Yolanda who had a big hand in caring for her day to day. When Nicole was 14, in April of 1995, her mother Angelica died by suicide. It was then Odd, Yolanda, and their family who helped Nicole get through that summer without her mother. In October of that same year, Nicole had already turned 15, and she got a job at a supermarket in Eindhoven. She was staying with her grandmother, who lived close enough that she could ride her bike to and from work. Early on Friday, October 6th, 1995, a bit after 5 a.m., Nicole left her grandmother's home on her bike to go to work. Around 6 a.m., when she hadn't arrived, a coworker went to check the route she normally took to see if they could find her along the way. When they couldn't, they did report that she hadn't turned up at work to the police. But it wasn't until the afternoon that her family became concerned. Nicole was supposed to pick up her sister from school at 3:30, but she never showed. She was again reported missing at 4:10 p.m., this time by the family, and the police took action. A formal search for her started around 5 p.m. This search sprawled out through the city, and around 6 p.m., officers found Nicole's gray bike in the Dommel River. It was about halfway between her grandmother's home and the shopping center where she worked. With the bicycle found in the river, divers immediately entered the water to search, but they couldn't find anything. Over the next several days, massive searches continued. There was an extensive search of a wooded park in town that the river runs through, though it's not clear if a tip brought them out there or it was just another place to look. They brought in a plane to do an aerial search, and then they turned to the overflow sewers near the river. But again, nothing was found. All of Nicole's family, friends, classmates, they were interviewed hoping that they had some information. Was Nicole known to be talking to anyone? Did she have a boyfriend? Had she talked about running away? They even interviewed a group of teens who had been detained for tormenting people on the bike path in that same area that Nicole would have been riding to work. Some of them knew Nicole from school, though it looks like based on the timeline that they had been taken in and detained before she went missing. The investigators must have thought they might know something, but it doesn't look like they did. The only thing out of the ordinary in Nicole's life was something she told her aunt. The day before she disappeared, she mentioned that she was riding her bike to work, and then some strange man tried to jump on the back. He didn't manage it, but it was weird and it freaked her out a bit. By October 11th, the police had gotten over 100 tips that they were working through, and some of these tips came through psychics. Some were unsolicited, but some were contacted by Nicole's father, Odd, and her stepmother, Yolanda. On October 17th, after yet another search, the investigators concluded that Nicole was definitely not in the river. And by this point, the case had turned into a media frenzy. Some of that had to do with the circumstances. She was a pretty young teenager who went missing in a city with a low crime rate. That was terrifying for people, particularly parents. But some of the media interest in the case had to do with her father, Odd van den Hurk, who was also known as Andy DeWitt, a singer. I have messed up my algorithm for my favorite streaming service by searching up his music, And I'm not really sure how to describe it. It sounds kind of like 80s pop, but a little folksy too. But I don't know what Dutch folk music sounds like, but it probably sounds like this, is my guess. Odd had a couple albums, and I'm not sure how popular he was as far as the general public goes, but he was definitely popular enough that the media interest in this case was pretty high. And Odd used that for sure to his advantage. His daughter was missing. He'd do whatever he could to get her picture in front of the public. He had cameras rolling when he walked the path Nicole had likely been riding that day, and he brought with him a psychic who was trying to get a reading on where she could have gone. The police reportedly weren't too thrilled with the family's insistence on psychics being used, particularly as it started attracting media attention of all types, which included tabloids. But as a parent, I imagine they just wanted answers that they weren't getting from the police, and if that meant talking to psychics, that's what it meant. The case did get another lead on October 19th when something more earthly was found, and that was Nicole's small black backpack. It was found tangled up in a bramble bush next to a bike path that ran along the canal. So the search moved to that area. Again, there was a search of the water, but also the banks of the canal, and they even had a cadaver dog who was specifically trained to work in and around water. Unfortunately, it was just yet another search that gave no clues as to where Nicole went. The physical searches were making the news, but early on at least, some other avenues that were being explored were done so a little less publicly. And one of those was reaching out to Nicole's German family, both her mother's side and her birth father's side. The theory they were exploring was that either a family member had taken her back to Germany or Nicole had run away to be with them. Things were pretty delicate with the situation. Odd viewed Nicole as his daughter, full stop. He did not like when papers picked up news about her having another father in Germany. And one publication said he threatened to sue them if they ran the story about it. He insisted that Nicole's mother told him he was the biological father, though the father in Germany, who had been paying child support for all those years, said that Odd and Angelica hadn't even met at the time she got pregnant. This was a very difficult situation for the family on a personal level, and I can't imagine going through those feelings while also dealing with a case like this in the public eye. But the investigators had to look at all the possibilities regardless, and those things ended up getting reported on. The investigators found no signs Nicole had gone to Germany or had gone anywhere else, though the possibility she ran away was still on the table. They got a tip on October 24th that Nicole was spotted at a gas station in Venlo on October 6th. Venlo is a border town. It's on the Dutch-German border. And this man who saw Nicole or thought he saw her did know her. He didn't know her well, but a sighting by someone even a little familiar with the missing person is always something to follow up on. But this lead, like hundreds of others, led nowhere. Nicole's family thought the police were on the wrong track entirely with both their running away theory and the idea she would have gone to Germany. On November 21st, it was announced that the family was starting a formal organization so that they could raise money for searches, printing flyers, and all the other expenses that have to do with searching for your missing loved one. But then, on the very next day after this announcement was made, on November 22nd, 1995, 15-year-old Nicole van den Hurk's body was found about 30 minutes east of Eindhoven. A hiker was going through the woods around 12:30 in the afternoon when something caught their eye. They looked closer and realized that it was a body hidden under some branches. The state of Nicole's remains indicated that she had been dead for a while and very possibly since the day she was last seen. Though the specific cause of death could not be determined due to the state of her remains, there were sharp edge cuts on the left side of her forehead, and her jaw was fractured. She also had an injury to her rib that was likely the result of a stabbing. The police knew now that Nicole hadn't just run away. And finding her body did bring in some more tips, but by the middle of January, the investigation was starting to lull. To try to get more tips coming in, the police played a phone call they had gotten back in the early days of the investigation while Nicole was still missing. The caller did not identify himself, but he said he knew who killed Nicole. But then he hung up. They hoped by broadcasting the call, they would get somebody who recognized his voice to call in, and they could either follow up on it and see what he knew or rule it out as a possible prank or hoax. But whatever they did find out through this investigation, it didn't lead the case forward. On January 17th, 1996, they greatly reduced the number of people working on the case to just 4, and they were only going to follow up on tips that came in. And though the tips did slow down, one that got media attention came in on February 8th. A girl from Eindhoven, who we will call Elise, was arrested in Miami on suspicion of drug smuggling. She told the police that she had been forced by a drug gang to smuggle the drugs, and that gang had been behind Nicole's murder. 3 to 4 mornings a week, I am scrounging through my kitchen looking for something light to eat that will also fuel me through my workout. And now the decision is made for me thanks to IQ bars. Start each day right with IQ bars, brain and body boosting bars, hydration mixes, and mushroom coffees. Their ultimate sampler pack includes all 3. Get 7 IQ bar flavors, 4 IQ mix flavors, and 4 IQ Joe flavors. And today my listeners get an exclusive offer of 20% off plus free shipping. Just text Crimelines to 64,000 because you are going to want to try that ultimate sampler pack. You get to try all of the products and flavors. IQ bars are plant protein bars that are vegan, gluten-free, and low in sugar and carbs. And I've loved every flavor I've tried. And then they have the refreshing IQ Mix, which is a zero sugar drink mix that hydrates with electrolytes. And for some jitter-free instant coffee, they have IQ Joe, which is packed with 200 milligrams of natural caffeine and brain-boosting magnesium in 4 delicious flavors. Refuel smarter with IQ Bar's Ultimate Sampler Pack. That's 7 IQ bars, 4 IQ Mix sticks, and 4 IQ Joe sticks. And now my special podcast listeners get 20% off all IQ Bar products plus free shipping. To get your 20% off, just text Crimelines to 64,000. Get your discount. Text Crimelines to 64,000. That's CRIMELINES to 64000. Message and data rates may apply. See terms for details.
America. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At Grand Canyon University, we believe in equal opportunity, and the American dream starts with purpose. By honoring your career calling, you impact your family, your friends, and your community. The pursuit to serve others is yours. Find your purpose at Grand Canyon University. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu.
When this information was provided to Nicole's family, Ach said he knew who Elise was. She did know Nicole, and at the time, he leaned towards believing her. I'm not sure if it's because he knew Elise to be an honest and trustworthy person, or if 3 months after Nicole's body was found, he was just desperate for a resolution, and he wanted to believe her. Investigators from Eindhoven traveled to Miami in mid-March to speak with Elise, and she was then returned to the Netherlands. Due to inconsistencies in her story, the police soon dropped the lead and instead pivoted to look closer to home. In late April, Odd complained to the media that the police, instead of looking for Nicole's real killer, were instead focusing on the family. Specifically, they were looking at the men in the family, like Odd's adult sons. On May 22, 1996, they arrested Nicole's 21-year-old stepbrother, Andy, on suspicion of involvement in Nicole's death, and that allowed them to detain him for questioning. Andy had been born during one of Odd's previous marriages that ended in 1978, and his mother did not give him the Vanden Hurk surname because she didn't really want him connected to his father. In spite of that, Odd tried to build a relationship with his son, and Andy did visit on occasion. He ended up living with his dad for a period of time when he was 12 and Nicole was 7, but it didn't last long. Andy later described his relationship with Nicole as more like cousins than brother and sister. The police said they suspected Andy as a result of their investigation, and we don't know exactly what that means, but we do know that Andy had a rough life. Odd himself called Andy unstable, though he regretted saying that quite that way later on. But the truth was, Andy struggled significantly with his mental health, starting at the age 13 and continuing for his entire life. With his depression and anxiety resistant to treatment, he used substances to cope, and he was bouncing from place to place without much of a steady living arrangement at the time. Andy was held in question for 5 days before he was released. There was nothing to tie him to Nicole's murder, so they had no choice but to release him without charge. And then a week and a half later, on June 7th, the police made another arrest in the case, and this time it was Odd. Based on one interview I read a translation of, it sounds like Odd thought his media offensive was part of why he was suspected. He said he didn't expect it to have that effect, meaning having everyone, including the police, watching his every move and side-eyeing him. And I think this catches a lot of families off guard when they realize after doing media appearances how harshly they are being judged for what they say and how they say it. What Odd knew at the time was that he had a little more fame than the average person, and his child was missing. So he leveraged his fame in a way he thought would help. Like with Andy, Odd was questioned and then released after 5 days when there was, quote, no reasonable suspicion of guilt. The investigators have not said what led them specifically to suspect either Andy or Odd, and then what led them away from them. But that is pretty typical in the Dutch system. They usually don't release much about suspects for people's privacy. It is so different from here in the US, where I know a lot of details about a lot of people who were suspected but never convicted of a crime. After these 2 arrests, the case cooled way down. Aside from assuring the public that it was still being worked on, there was little reporting on this case for several years. By mid-2004, the case had been reviewed completely by a national investigatory team, and they had done a full inventory of the evidence, what leads had been followed through on, which ones had not been, and they created a report. That report was then given to a cold case team who spent several months reinvestigating the case. But by the end of the year, this investigation had finished with no answers. By this point, Nicole's family was finding their footing again after many years of struggling under their grief and the injustice of it all. Odd and Yolanda ended up splitting up, with Odd moving to Spain. His music career in the Netherlands was all but over, so he was working as a lyricist instead. Nicole's stepbrother Andy moved to England. And that's where he was living when, on March 8th, 2011, out of nowhere, a confession came in. Andy took to Facebook and posted that he was going to be arrested for Nicole's murder because he confessed. He wrote that he would be in contact soon. Andy was then arrested by the British police. Andy's attorney in England pretty much immediately asked for a psychological examination, but the judge was ready to just get Andy back to the Netherlands and let it be dealt with in their jurisdiction. So Andy returned to the Netherlands in custody on March 30th, and he was held for 5 days as allowed under the law. While in custody, Andy denied that he had killed Nicole, and he made some pretty serious accusations against his father, including that his father had abused and killed Nicole. The investigators did not believe him. He was still their suspect, and they wanted to hold him longer than the 5 days. A magistrate, however, said that they couldn't keep holding him because they didn't have any evidence against him. Andy's Facebook post was pretty much the only evidence, and it wasn't really a confession. It was just him saying he confessed without him actually saying what he did. Andy would later say in 2016 that the goal of his confession was to get the case reopened and reinvestigated, and he recognized that it was a risky thing to do because it could have meant he got railroaded for the murder himself. But it did end up working in the sense that it did get the case looked at again. The investigators weren't sure that Andy didn't do it, so I imagine some of them hoped the evidence found would prove their case for them. In looking at old evidence that they had in storage from 1995, they identified a few things to send in for more advanced DNA testing, which included a few clothing items and swabs from Nicole's autopsy, particularly the ones taken during the sexual assault evidence collection. Though Nicole had been found clothed, they believed she had been raped, so these swabs had been saved. And while those items were sent for more advanced DNA testing, Nicole's body was exhumed on September 9th, 2011. 4 days later, the investigators announced that they had found what they believed to be traces of the person they believed was the killer, and they didn't find them on her body, but rather from those old swabs. Unfortunately, the new examinations of Nicole's remains did not provide additional DNA. But the DNA they got from the old evidence had 2 distinct male profiles, and they believed that they had come from sperm. They were able to identify one of the contributors as they ran the DNA against people in Nicole's life, and it came back as belonging to her boyfriend. The other sample was an unknown male. But there were some issues with this DNA. It was a mixed sample, and there was possibly a third contributor. There were parts that didn't match either the boyfriend or the unknown male. It was possible that this was due to contamination. Nicole's body had been left out in the elements for 7 weeks, and the collection and storage practices of the 1990s left much to be desired. We see contamination issues in DNA today with all we know about storage and collection, so just imagine what happened with these from 1995 until 2011. There are some places that report that Nicole's stepbrother Andy could not be excluded as the third contributor. There are some that say he was definitely the third contributor, but I cannot find out where that's coming from. I have not found an official source, as in with the police saying it, and the court papers that I have access to actually says the opposite. It says that there were no similarities with the DNA profiles of suspects or other people involved, and we could assume that includes Andy as he was a suspect at the time the tests were run. So I don't know where that piece of information is coming from, but if anyone out there does know where this information is coming from, please email it to me and help clear up my confusion on why some reports are saying one thing but the court is saying something else. It may have helped if they could figure out who this mysterious DNA belonged to, because then they could investigate that person and rule them in or out. The unknown contributor of the DNA was going to be an issue at any trial because it's handing the defense a reasonable alternative suspect. But they would have to get this case to trial before they could even cross that bridge. And step 1 was to figure out who the unknown male DNA belonged to. This was before forensic genetic genealogy was used to find people, but after the Dutch had begun collecting DNA from those convicted of crimes. They had a database set up since the late 1990s, and it was overseen by the National Forensics Institute. In looking at other offenders from the Eindhoven area, particularly those convicted of sex crimes, the investigators asked the NFI to compare the unknown male profile to a man who had attacked a young woman who was riding her bike 5 years after Nicole's murder. This man is known as Jos de Hay, and Hay is the letter G. In the Netherlands, journalists never name suspects, and even those found guilty are generally just referred to by their first name and their last initial. This is due to their code of ethics. Using just a first name and an initial leaves more room for the presumption of innocence, as well as protecting the accused's family from unfair scrutiny and invasions of their privacy. And even after a person is convicted, they will likely be released someday and deserve to be able to re-enter society after they've paid their debt. So, in alignment with the Dutch standards, I'm just going to stick with calling him Jos. Jos ended up on the police radar in Nicole's case because of the similarities in the circumstances of her murder and the person he was convicted of raping 5 years later. On September 23, 2000, Jos hopped on the back of a bike of a young woman, and he said he was going to stab her if she didn't continue riding. He then took her to another location and raped her. He was convicted in January of 2001 for that crime. There were a few reasons this case seemed similar to Nicole's. The first was that the victim was riding a bicycle, and the second was she was threatened with a knife, which is how they believe Nicole was killed. And if you remember, Nicole's aunt had said she complained about a guy trying to jump on her bike the day before she went missing. Jos had also been accused in a 1987 rape, which included the woman riding a bike. And in that case, he allegedly threw the bike in a ditch prior to the rape, not unlike Nicole's bike being discarded in the river. As part of the rape case in 2000, Jos had to give a DNA sample that was then in the national database. So on October 30th, 2012, the public prosecutor asked that the DNA profile from Nicole's case be compared directly against Jos's DNA. That report came back that he could not be excluded as one of the donors of the DNA found. This wasn't a slam dunk, so additional testing was done, and they were able to get a higher probability that it was his DNA about a year later in October of 2013. Also in 2013, they were able to test a hair that was found on Nicole's jacket, testing that was impossible in previous years. And they got a result that the mitochondrial DNA from that profile matched Jos. While waiting on testing, they were also investigating Jos, obviously, as a potential suspect, but it is hard to verify someone's alibi from nearly 20 years before. But what they did learn was that Jos reported his car stolen on October 25th, less than 3 weeks after Nicole went missing. The car was found on December 1st in a river, and the key was in the ignition. So maybe Jos had left the key in his car and someone took it. Or maybe he had to get rid of it to hide the evidence that he raped, killed, and/or transported a body in that vehicle. Finding the perfect gift for your mom or your mother-in-law can be so stressful because you want to give them something they're really going to love, but also something they're going to use. We all have too much stuff just sitting around. And that's where the Skylight Frame comes in. The Skylight Frame is a touchscreen photo frame that your whole family can upload photos to, and they appear in seconds. You get to share your favorite moments with the people who matter most to you. The perfect gift for moms and grandmas. It is so simple to use. The setup takes less than 60 seconds, and the least tech-savvy among us, meaning me and my mother-in-law, even we figured it out. The Skylight Frame has a touch screen so that you can swipe through photos with your finger, but you can also tap the heart button to thank the person who sent that photo in. And what I love is that anyone can send photos to the frame in just seconds using email or the app, because then the photos aren't just coming from me and they're from the whole family. It holds thousands of photos that'll continuously rotate throughout the day. And they offer 100% satisfaction guaranteed. If you don't love your Skylight, they'll offer you a full refund. As a special limited time offer for my listeners, get 15% off your purchase of a Skylight Frame when you go to skylightframe.com/crimelines. That's SKYLIGHTFRAME.com/crimelines. Mother's Day is coming right up, so order today to get 15% off your purchase at skylightframe.com/crimelines. The investigators tried to track the vehicle down, but after it had been pulled from the water, it was shipped to another country to be used either in whole or pieced out, and there was just no way of getting it back. But the DNA results they had were enough to get an arrest warrant for Joss, and he was arrested on January 14th, 2014 on suspicion of murder or manslaughter and on suspicion of rape. At the time, Joss was still on some type of supervised release from his 2001 conviction. So I'm going off Google translations here. Apologies if my understanding is incorrect. But it seems to me that in the Netherlands, they have an option to detain people after they have served their prison sentence if they would benefit from continued treatment. It is abbreviated to TBS, and the length of the treatment phase is at the determination of the government. The goal is to reduce the rates of recidivism in high-risk offenders. People who are on a TBS type plan live in clinics or hospitals before they are eventually allowed to start living independently. They usually stay near the clinic and get the court-ordered treatment as an outpatient. And that's the point Joss was in here when he was arrested. He was living independently. Prior to his arrest, we know that Joss's TBS had been extended, with his treatment provider saying that he would become aggressive easily and that his chance of recidivism remained high. After Joss's arrest, in Nicole's case, he was held in jail, but he asked to be moved to a TBS clinic, which that request was denied. This case didn't go to trial until November of 2015, though both sides had been in and out of court with all of the usual pretrial hearings. And in that time, the prosecution dropped the murder charge down to a charge of manslaughter. In the Netherlands, murder is an intentional and premeditated killing. Manslaughter is an intentional killing without premeditation. This manslaughter charge doesn't mean they think Joss didn't intend to kill Nicole, just that they couldn't prove he premeditated it. It really sounds a lot like what second-degree murder is in a lot of states. Another thing that happened in the year and a half of pretrial hearings was that Nicole's reputation was pretty much smeared by the defense, which was very difficult for her family. Essentially, the defense was that the DNA was not Joss's, but if it was because he lived a rough life where he had a lot of sex with a lot of women, so much so that he could have had consensual sex with Nicole and forgotten about it. While it may have been possible that Joss had sex with a stranger, to prove this, the defense would have to basically say that Nicole, who was 15 years old, was living the same type of lifestyle. They even wanted to bring it up at trial that Nicole may have been pregnant, and that would give another person a motive to kill her. The truth was they didn't know if Nicole was pregnant or not based on the state of her remains, and if she was likely so early that she wouldn't have known it herself, so this would not be allowed at trial. But this painting of Nicole as anything other than an ordinary teenager with a boyfriend and friends and a social life, to make it sound like she was running around having sex with men 10 years older than her, it was so hurtful to her family because it wasn't true, and her family knew it wasn't true, and to just hear her portrayed in a way that wasn't accurate was devastating. Another thing that was very hurtful to the family was that Yolanda, Nicole's stepmother, was not going to be allowed to testify in court. Just like in U.S. trials, the family generally testifies about their loved one and the impact of the crime. But as a step-parent, even though she had been raising Nicole for years, Yolanda had no standing in the Dutch courts to testify in that capacity. This also applied to Nicole's little sister Debbie, who was 6 when she went missing and was obviously greatly impacted by Nicole's murder. But she was not a blood relation, so she was not allowed to speak. Because Odd was legally recognized as Nicole's father, he would be allowed. But this reminds me of something that we saw here recently in the case of J.J. Vallow. After his adoptive mother, Lori Vallow-Daybell, was convicted of his murder, they did not let his grandfather give a victim impact statement because he was, technically speaking, JJ's step-grandfather. Even though he raised JJ alongside his wife up to when Lori adopted him, and he lived and breathed being JJ's grandfather, that wasn't a recognized family relation in the eyes of the court. So Nicole's family had been hurt by the legal process a number of times by the time this trial started on November 2nd, 2015. It started the day Nicole went missing and continued with the police saying she must have run away. And then after her body was found, they arrest her brother and then her father. And now here they were 20 years later, suffering her name being dragged through the mud and their family structure being deemed less than, all in the name of justice. But the trial finally started and testimony was expected to take about a week, and then the verdict would be delivered by the panel of judges sometime in December. However, the trial hit a few snafus, and that did not happen. On November 10th, after the trial was underway, 2 witnesses called the police. They both said they had served time with Joss in the same TBS hospital, and they claimed that Joss had confessed to having killed a girl in the past. The prosecution wanted the trial paused while they determined if these witnesses were credible or not. The story from Witness 1 was that he and Joss had been assigned to go do garden work at the clinic, but it was closed, so they ended up with some free time. They were sitting talking, and Joss said he had done worse than what he was in the TBS clinic for. Witness number 1 joked, "What'd you do, steal a bike?" And Joss said no. He said he had actually murdered someone. The witness thought it was possible that Joss was just joking, or possibly he was trying to be tougher than he was in the hospital. The man just told Joss he shouldn't say stuff like that, and then it wasn't until he heard Joss was actually arrested and there was DNA evidence that he realized it was not a joke. Witness number 2 had more details of the crime. He said that Joss said something to him that he killed a girl because she made fun of him. He said it wasn't premeditated and he didn't have any weapons on him, so he strangled her and then stabbed her with a branch. Like the first witness, he said he didn't take Joss seriously until he saw the story on the news. The defense said that the witnesses were unreliable and that they were only after the reward. They didn't want the testimony to be considered at all, and the judges would eventually agree with the defense, but we'll get into that when we get to the whole verdict. The trial resumed on December 4th with more testimony about DNA evidence. There was so much disagreement among the experts over the probability of the DNA match and the entire process that they decided to go ahead and retest things using even more refined methods. DNA technology had moved so quickly from 2011 until the start of the trial. They were able to redo the testing in March of 2016, and in April, court resumed to hear testimony that it was 2.28 million times more likely than not that Joss was the contributor of the DNA. I watch a lot of U.S. trials, and the idea that they would hit pause on things to clear up conflicting expert testimony is kind of strange to me. But if a trial really is for fact-finding, it makes sense to use the tools you have. Now, that said, I do understand why it's easier in the Netherlands to handle things like this. For one, they did not have a jury they were holding up. This is a panel of judges. And in 2022, the Netherlands had a population of 17.7 million people and only 142 murders. Comparing that to New York, the state in the U.S. with the most comparable population, New York had 762 murders. So I imagine their court systems can take a little bit more time with individual murder trials since they don't have nearly as many of them. In the end, this trial was finally over in November of 2016. Rather than a month to conduct a trial and get a verdict, it took a year. The panel of judges took the information to deliberate, and when they gave their verdict, they went through the case point by point to make factual rulings to explain that verdict. And here they had two charges to consider. We have the rape and the manslaughter. So as for the charge of rape, the court said it was proper that Joss's previous crimes be considered in this case. The defense said they shouldn't be because they weren't similar enough to the prosecution's theory as to what happened to Nicole. But the court pointed out they were very similar. In both the 1987 rape and the 2000 rape, Joss approached the victims while they were riding bikes on public roads and then took them to a second location. In the 1987 case, he threw the bike in a ditch, like Nicole's bike being thrown in the water. And in the 2000 rape, Joss hit the woman several times and threatened to stab her, and we know Nicole had been hit and very likely stabbed. The court then accepted that Joss was the contributor to the DNA found on Nicole's body. So the question was, could it have been consensual? And the court rejected that idea. Nicole had a best friend who she told everything to, and she never mentioned having sex with any older men. Nicole had only talked about sex within the context of relationships with boys who were her age. There was little chance Joss and Nicole would have overlapped socially. While she did go out with friends and maybe sometimes tell her parents she was at a friend's house when she was really out on the town, it was very unlikely that a 15-year-old was in the same place the rougher group Joss hung out with would have been. Nicole also only went out with friends, so she wouldn't have met him without one of them knowing about it. Additionally, Joss himself testified in court at a hearing that he only slept with grown women, never a 15-year-old. So he said if he did have sex with Nicole, it would have been because he thought she was older. In the pictures of Nicole that have been released to the public, which are her school pictures, she has her hair styled and her makeup on, so she looks a little older maybe, but she certainly still looks like a teenager. Joss wouldn't have met her in a bar and immediately thought she was over 18. It seems improbable to the extreme that the two ever met, let alone had sex. Therefore, the judges found that there was enough evidence to justify a rape conviction. As for the manslaughter charges, the court considered the testimony of the two men who had been in the TBS program with Josh, and the prosecution thought their stories should have been considered at trial, but the judges disagreed. Both witnesses had admitted they talked to each other about their stories, so they weren't as independent as they seemed initially. And they also talked with each other about the reward. So they were aware there was an incentive to come forward. Based on other testimony, it came out that the TBS clinics had a social hierarchy. Not everyone in these programs is a sex offender. They have all sorts of people who committed crimes and needed additional treatment to avoid reoffending. So when we look at the social structure of those in the program, people there for sex crimes are at the very lowest tier. It seemed very unlikely that witness number 1 and number 2, who were in there for non-sex-related crimes, would have sat down to talk to Joss at all, or that he would have opened up to them about something that would actually cause his status to drop even further. The court ruled there was an insufficient basis to use these claims as evidence, which is something else so different to the U.S. system. I have seen plenty of cases where the jailhouse informant has an unlikely story and they're put on the stand regardless. Like in the John Juca case that I covered in September 2019. The informant said that he heard John's dad say something during a prison visit, but John's father had a stroke and he could not physically have said what he claimed. But he was put on the stand anyway. He did later recant, but you're going to have to go listen to that episode if you want a refresher on all the details. In that case, the Brooklyn courts were interested in incentivized testimony, but the Dutch court, in this case, absolutely was not. The judges did find, though, that there were other circumstances that pointed strongly towards Joss as Nicole's killer. For one, it naturally follows from the finding that he raped her that he was also the one who killed her. Raping a teenager is a serious offense, and he would have motive to kill her to keep her from going to the police. It does not seem like a coincidence that she died from a stabbing when that was what he threatened his other victim with. They also pointed out how Joss's car just so happened to get stolen with the keys in the ignition and dumped in water where evidence could be destroyed. But while these things indicated Joss was possibly the killer, the court said they needed to address the DNA that didn't match Joss or Nicole's boyfriend. The court determined it was realistic to believe that the trace DNA came from contamination in the collection or testing process. But they had to explore the other possibilities because, as the court wrote, they had to be sure of his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They did not believe there was a possibility that the DNA came from consensual sex with another person for the same reasons they didn't believe Nicole would have had consensual sex with Joss. There was no time in the week leading up to her murder for her to have engaged in some other sexual relationship, and she likely would have told her friend about it if she had. So the idea of an alternative suspect would mean that the other potential suspect would have also raped Nicole prior to her death. And they found that this, taken by itself, was possible, even if it was unlikely. So then the court considered Joss's behavior after his arrest. Initially, he invoked his right to remain silent until he was in front of a magistrate. He asked to speak at that point, and that's when he said he did not have sex with Nicole, but if he did, it was consensual and he forgot about it. This was interesting to me because in the U.S., juries are told they are not to judge a defendant's silence as evidence one way or the other in regards to guilt. But in the court ruling here, they said that a suspect's silence is significant if they have an answer to the accusation against them. So if Joss had an explanation that did not implicate him in any crime, like, yes, I had sex with her, but I left her alive at such and such place, he should have said so. They can take from his silence that he had no alternative explanation. However, because the court found that Joss had raped Nicole, and saying, yes, I raped her, but I left her alive, would implicate himself in a crime, he had the right to remain silent in totality. His explanation for how he didn't kill her included a different crime, so he couldn't be compelled to speak, and then it couldn't be held against him that he didn't. So taken as a whole, the court found that the DNA was the real issue here in proving manslaughter. The possibility of a third contributor of the DNA meant there was a possibility someone else was involved and that person killed Nicole. All that to say that the judges found 49-year-old Joss guilty of rape and not guilty of manslaughter. He was then sentenced to 5 years in prison. But this case is not over because in the Netherlands, both sides can appeal, and appeal they did. Joss was appealing his rape conviction and the prosecution was appealing the manslaughter acquittal. The hearing for these appeals lasted for 4 days, and Joss reiterated that he was innocent of all charges, so not much had changed there. But something significant had happened for the family in this 2018 appeal. Due to the outcry at Nicole's family members being excluded from speaking at the original trial, the rules were changed to recognize members of the immediate family who were not blood related, like step-parents and step-siblings and foster families. So after 23 years, Yolanda was finally allowed to testify on the record about the impact of losing the daughter she had raised. As for the prosecution and the defense, they just argued the evidence. The defense said it was insufficient to prove the rape, and the prosecution argued it was sufficient to prove both the rape and the manslaughter. And the court disagreed with the defense on all points. First, they upheld the rape conviction, and second, they overturned the acquittal for manslaughter. But that didn't mean it was sent back to the trial court. It meant the acquittal was now a conviction. The prosecution asked for a 14-year prison sentence, but the court gave Joss 12 years. In 2020, the Supreme Court upheld the verdict. Nicole's family said they didn't really care about Joss's sentence in regards to the manslaughter charge. Even if Joss only got 5 days added on, he was recognized as the killer of Nicole, and that was very important to them. It let them say to Nicole that they finally got justice for her. As of this recording, Joss remains incarcerated, and Nicole's family has paved the way for other stepfamilies, foster families, and other non-blood relatives to be recognized by the courts as who they really are, family. Thank you for listening. If you want more content, check out my other show, Crimelines and Consequences, wherever you get your podcasts. I also offer bonus content and ad-free listening at patreon.com/crimelines or through the Apple Podcast app. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basement4productions.com/support.